All right, everybody. This is part 2 of our lesson on money. Apologize for the weird lighting. This is the best I could do. I made a couple of mistakes in the last lecture where we learned about the functions of money and the kinds of money. I said that the United States moved into the Bretton Woods system in the 1970s. We actually left the Bretton Woods system when we abandoned the gold standard and moved from a representative currency to a fiat currency. It was still under Nixon, but we left the Bretton Woods system. The other mistake I made was that I wrote the barter of system on the board. It's supposed to be the barter system, but you already knew that. Okay, today we're going to learn another list. By the way, depending on how my sword fight today goes, this lesson may be coming to you from beyond the grave, but hopefully it'll go well. The next list we're going to learn is the definitions of money. Okay, let's go ahead and write definitions of money. This is a little awkward. I'm using my daughter's dry erase board, so it's kind of short. But the definitions of money kind of ask the question, what counts as money? Just cash? Does a checking account count? What counts? Well, it depends on what definition of money you're using. Economists have different reasons to use different definitions of money in different contexts. We're actually going to only use one of them, but we're going to make the whole list here. And test questions about this tend to be pretty easy. All right, there's one little trick. So first of all, these are sometimes called the M's. You'll see why. The first definition of money is M1, and it includes three things. Cash. Some people say cash and coin. That's a number 1. I'm listing the three things. Cash and coin. It might say currency and coin, but either way, it's cash. The second thing that it includes is checking accounts or checking deposits. We call them demand deposits. But it might be called checking deposit. It might be called checking account. You know what that means. That is an account where you can demand the money very quickly and very easily by writing a check, or I'd usually do so by sliding my debit card. That debits my demand deposit, my checking account. All right, and by the way, just so you'll know, the biggest component of M1 is actually not cash, it's checking accounts. Most people have most of their money in the form of a checking account. Think about it. Do you have more cash in your pocket or more in your checking account? I have far more in my checking account. Another component of M1 that is sometimes even left totally off the list because it's becoming a little obsolete and it's such a small portion of M1 is traveler's checks. Now, traveler's checks. This used to be a common way to store money if you were going to travel. You would be afraid, what if I lose all my cash? It'll just be gone, and I'm in Europe. You might go to a company like American Express, trade in your cash for traveler's checks. They were still very spendable in other countries at hotels and things like that. But if you lost them, you could call American Express and have them canceled. Now you can do that with your credit card. So a lot of people are abandoning the use of traveler's checks. It's very common to see this one not even on the list. Don't let it bother you if it's not. All right, so that's M1. And M1 is defined by these three things are very spendable, or very liquid, you might say. Liquidity is the property of being spendable. All right, these things are the most liquid types of money, and we're going to use these as our usable definition of money later in class. All right, the second definition of money is M2. Now, here's the trick. M2 is not three other things, and that's it. M2 is all the stuff in M1 plus three more things. All right, so M1 is those three things. M2 is all the stuff in M1 plus its own three more things. Okay? And these three things are going to be a little less liquid, a little less spendable. They're going to require some extra step to spend them. Okay? So, for example, I have a savings account. My savings account is a little bit harder to spend than my checking account. All right, this would be called a savings account or a savings deposit, same thing. Sorry, savings accounts, because we're doing all of them together, and savings deposits, same thing. I can't really go into a store and say, I'd like to spend my savings account on these groceries. I would have to go convert my savings account money into cash or into a checking account to spend it. So these require, the additional components of M2 require an extra step to spend. All right, now, savings accounts pay interest. That's why you would keep your money. You sacrifice some liquidity, some spendability, but you get interest. There's another kind of savings account called a money market account. All right, it's even less spendable. It earns its interest in a special way, though. That's why it gets a separate listing here. That is, it's just like a savings account. You put money in it, you earn interest, but the bank or wherever the bank you're storing your money at will earn the interest using money markets, which is beyond the scope of this class. The third component of M2 is something called small time deposits, and you're going to see that these are clearly not as liquid as the others. Okay, a small time deposit, in the United States we call these CDs, for certificates of deposit. This is the kind of money, way to store wealth where you say, well, I want to keep my money in the bank, but I'm going to promise the bank I'm not going to go touch this money for some pre-specified amount of time. I might promise the bank I'm not going to go get it for 6 months. You know you can have it for 6 months and I won't go get it. Or I'm not going to go get it for a year or 3 years or 5 years. Or you could have a 10-year CD. And the longer you're willing to tell the bank, I promise I won't touch it, you are sure you're going to have it, the more interest it's likely to pay. But you can see that you'd sacrifice some liquidity. The bank is going to pay you a lot more interest if you're willing to tell them, I'm not going to come get this money. By the way, if you have a CD and you really desperately need it, you can actually go get it, but you must pay a penalty for getting it before it matures, is the actual term for it. All right, so you can see how that's not nearly as liquid as something like cash or checking accounts. All right, and then, of course, there's M3. Now, M3 is falling out of use. The American central bank, called the Fed, which we'll learn about later, doesn't calculate and publish M3 anymore. M3 is all the things in M1, and it's all the things we have so far. So all the things together here are M2, plus one more thing, which is large time deposits. What a shock. Now, these are so large that they are even harder to make into cash or make into a checking account that you can then spend. What's the difference between small and large, by the way? This is not something I have memorized. I went and looked this up. It's small means, well, they're worth less than $100,000. So it says less than 100K. Large means they're worth more than $100,000. All right, very exciting stuff. Now, you can imagine what a test question would look like. This is M3, sorry. A test question would try to trick you into saying M2 is just these three things. No, M2 is actually all 6 of these things. Or M3 is just this one thing. No, it's all 7 of these things. All right, so a test question will give you a list of these. Let me move my camera just a touch. We'll give you a list of these with dollar amounts and say add up M2 and try to trick you into just adding these 3 when you want to add all of them together. But from now on in this class, we are going to use M1. When I say the supply of money from now on, I will be referring to M1, this top one, cash and checking accounts or demand deposits. I'm not even going to really think about traveler's checks because that's such a small, insignificant portion. All right, now let's learn something a little more, a little more exciting, the market for money. It turns out money, like almost everything else, has a market, which means it has a supply and a demand. All right, and I'm just going to draw the market for money for you. All right, it's 2 axes. All right, there's a demand for money, and what a shock, it's a downward sloping demand curve, like every demand curve we've done so far. There it is. All right. God, kneeling is uncomfortable. All right, so there's the demand for money. Now, I like to go ahead and subscript it with a capital M to say that's the demand for money, the demand for M1, cash and checking accounts. All right, why is it downward sloping? I'll explain in a little bit. All right, it's got a quantity, just like any old market. I like to subscript it with an M for money. Capital M, by the way. It's got a price. Okay, I know there's a supply too, but hold on. It's got a price. The price of money is the interest rate. And unlike remember the loanable funds market, the market for loaning and borrowing, which had the real interest rate as its price, this one has the nominal interest rate. Now, I have trouble remembering that. By the way, lowercase I is the nominal interest rate. You can write nominal if you want, just to make it clear. But I have trouble remembering which one is real, which one is nominal. Well, I remember, here's how I do it. It's stupid, but it works. M for money and N for nominal are next to each other in the alphabet, and they go together on the money market. So I guess if nominal goes with money, real interest rate must go with loanable funds. I know it's cheesy. That's how I remember it, and it works. All right, and then finally, the supply of money. You might expect the supply of money to look like our supply curves and be upward sloping, but it's not. The supply of money doesn't depend on the nominal interest rate. It is actually set, and it's set by part of our government called the Fed. We'll learn about it, the Fed, later. So it's vertical. And I guess that makes sense. It's the same. It is this same quantity no matter what the nominal interest rate is. If the nominal interest rate was something really low, this would be the supply of money because the Fed set it there. If the nominal interest rate was something medium, it would still be the same amount, this same quantity, all right, because the Fed set it there. If the nominal interest rate was very high, it would still be this same amount because the Fed set it there, all right? Now, why do we learn this? I would say this next to aggregate demand and aggregate supply, this is the second most important graph we learn. By the way, don't label this one aggregate demand. This is not the aggregate demand curve. This is not the aggregate supply curve. This is the supply of money and the demand for money. Why is this so important? Well, we're going to see later on that the Fed is one of the most powerful organizations in the United States, and therefore one of the most powerful organizations in the world, because the Fed can set that supply of money and they can move it to the right or to the left, and that will change where these lines cross and change the interest rates. All right? That is very, very important. It's in the newspaper when it happens. I was reading a list of the most powerful women in the world. Number 1 on the list was the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Number 2 on the list was the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Fed, the first woman we've ever had in that position. Her name is Janet Yellen, and she is that powerful because she chairs the organization that moves that curve. By the way, while we're on the subject of moving things, I know we're used to moving demand curves. We move the aggregate demand curve all the time. Don't ever move the demand for money. Don't move the demand for money. Don't move the demand for money. Draw it, you need it, but don't move it. All right? You may be tempted to, but don't do it. It's wrong. I will not give you a timed writing where the correct answer is to move the demand for money. I will not give you a test where the correct answer is to move the demand for money. There are some things that can move the demand for money. It's very rare. It's very rare to be on the AP test. It's very rare to be on a college final. And it is so rare that you're not allowed to do it. All right? I'll teach you later in the semester the things that might move it when we get a little more comfortable with this. But for now, the one you're allowed to move is the one the Fed moves, the supply of money. All right, let's talk quickly about that demand for money. Supply of money is easy. It's the quantity of money is set by the Fed. The demand for money is downward sloping, and so we got to explain why. All right? And it is because there are 2 reasons people demand money. All right? And they sum up to that demand curve which we just drew, which is the total demand for money. All right? So I'm going to draw 2 different demand curves for money. There's one. There's another one. Quantity of money, nominal interest rate. And then these 2 things added together are going to equal a total demand for money, which I'm going to draw down here. Let me make sure you can see. You can. All right. Quantity of money. This is going to be there. We just saw that the total demand for money curve looks like this. All right. Well, what are its 2 components? There are 2 reasons a human being might demand money. One is to buy stuff, to buy goods and buy services. All right. So that is referred to as the transactions demand for money. Transactions, which means buying demand for money. And the transactions demand for money doesn't care about the interest rate. No matter what the interest rate is, whether the interest rate is some tiny amount, some medium amount, or some big amount, you still got to pay your bills. And you still got to have money to buy things at the grocery store. You still have to have money in your checking account to pay your rent, to buy stuff at the hardware store. All right? To go to restaurants. You need money to buy things with, no matter if the interest rate is high, medium, or low. So it's some set amount. There's the transactions demand for money. All right? So, there's it. Here, let me move this, put this up here in the title. There's the transactions demand for money. It's some set amount. It's the only demand curve, by the way, all year long that is not downward sloping. But it gets added up with something else, and it becomes downward sloping anyway. The thing that it gets added up with is the other reason people demand money. It's called the asset demand for money. That is a reason to demand money because you want to store your wealth in the form of cash or a checking account. All right? And there are reasons to do that. We'll talk about it in a second. But some people store their wealth, yes, as ownership of stocks, ownership of companies called stocks in the stock market. Some people store their wealth as collectibles, like as art or jewelry or baseball cards. Some people store their wealth in lots of different forms, but one place to store your wealth is you can just keep it as cash or in your checking account. All right? And if you do, well, hold on, what would be the advantage of storing your wealth as cash? You could spend it right away. If you suddenly needed it, you could spend it. So it is, our word for spendability, for you can spend it, is that cash in a checking account is very liquid. The obvious disadvantage of storing your wealth as cash or a checking account is it's not in the bank earning interest. So I'm going to put here no interest. All right. So, wait a minute. That's going to tell me what the shape of this curve is going to be. Think about it. If the interest rate is super high, something gigantic, like you could earn 12% interest by putting your money in the bank. That's a huge disadvantage if you were to store your money as cash, like in your freezer like a drug dealer, or under your mattress, or in your checking account. You're giving up a huge interest rate. So you might say to yourself, well, I'm not going to store my money as cash. I would rather store it in a different way and earn that huge interest rate. So see how that's not very much? It's all dotted line. That's not very much. People don't want much cash or checking account if they can get a huge interest rate. If the interest rate is tiny, though, they say, may as well store my money as cash. Having my money in the, let's say it's 0.1%, you're thinking, have my money in the bank earns me 0.1%. That's nothing. I would rather have the liquidity of cash, so you might store a lot of your wealth as money. If there's something in between, it'd be medium. And so we get this downward sloping asset demand for money curve. When you sum these up, you get another downward sloping curve called the total demand for money. Allow me to demonstrate why. I'm going to need another colored marker. What did I do with them? Here they are. So if you look here, let's say at this medium interest rate, you see that here is the transactions demand for money, that amount. And here is the asset demand for money, that amount. Well, if I take those two and sum them up down here at this medium interest rate again, I get some amount from the transactions demand for money, some amount from the asset demand for money. All right, let's go up to the higher interest rate. Same amount for transactions, but tiny for asset. So, same amount for transactions, but tiny for asset. That's why it continues to be downward sloping. Let's do one more. If I go down here to the low interest rate and say, same amount for transaction, huge amount for asset demand for money. So I get same amount for transaction, huge amount for asset demand for money. So I get this downward, when I sum these, constant amount and downward sloping amount, I get another downward sloping amount. This is the one you're going to draw. This is the total demand for money. This is kind of advanced behind the scenes stuff. I might ask you a couple of questions. What is the transactions demand for money? What does it look like? What is the asset demand for money? What does it look like? Why? What are the advantages and disadvantages? But the one we're going to draw almost every day from now on is this total demand for money. All right. I'll see you on Wednesday, assuming my sword fight goes well. And many thanks to my daughter for letting me borrow her whiteboard.